New numbers tonight showing just how much tax revenue is leaving Wisconsin for border states which have legalized and regulated marijuana sales.
And this includes more than $36 million going to Illinois last year, nearly $6 million going to Michigan in 2024. These are coming from counties that border, of course, Wisconsin. They're legally selling marijuana in those states. All of this as bills to legalize both medical and recreational marijuana remain stalled in the state legislature. Jason Zimmerman joining us to break down the numbers along with the impact the issue could have on the November election. Jason?
Chris, Wisconsin will have a new governor, new speaker in the assembly, and a new majority leader in the state senate next January, with all three people holding those leadership positions right now, deciding not to seek re-election. It means state lawmakers, for the first time in a while, will have a fresh debate regarding marijuana, and the latest numbers just released by the Legislative Fiscal Bureau are likely to be a big part of it.
On the Wisconsin border from Michigan to Illinois, marijuana sales have become big business.
The economic value to restoring this plant back to our economy is huge. We can't even put a dollar amount on it.
However, there is a dollar amount estimated by state officials when it comes to how much Wisconsin residents are spending crossing state lines to buy marijuana. According to this memo by the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, Wisconsin residents contributed $36.1 million last year to the overall marijuana tax collected by Illinois. That's based on data from 36 dispensaries located in 5 of the 6 counties bordering Wisconsin. One of them doesn't have any dispensaries. Among the 5 that do, a total of $319.4 million in sales was generated, and the report concludes $132.4 million, or 41.5% of those sales, were made to out-of-state residents.
It's concerning that, yes, revenue is leaving the state, both tax-wise, but tourism dollars, without being a state that is looked at as recreational marijuana, we're losing some tourism there.
On the other side of the state, Michigan too is making money off Wisconsin residents. The most recent data from 2024 shows the state with 854 retailers and micro businesses which are licensed to sell cannabis. Of those licenses, 22 were located in counties bordering Wisconsin. The report states, assuming that each retailer, micro-business makes an equal amount of sales, those businesses in the UP brought in $85.4 million. And if using the same estimate as Illinois, 41.5% of sales came from Wisconsin residents, translating into $5.8 million in tax revenue collected. Minnesota is also mentioned in the report, which began legalized cannabis sales in September of 2025, but so far there's no data on taxes paid by Wisconsin residents. If Wisconsin makes changes, it's likely to be next year after the November election. It's a question we posed to Republican candidate for governor Tom Tiffany.
Well, I think in particular we should look out for our veterans. I mean, I've heard from so many veterans that suffer from PTSD, and I'm very open to that as well as medicinal. And I think we just work our way through it and get to a good spot in regards to marijuana.
Among Democrats running for governor, at least 7 have come out supporting efforts to legalize marijuana, aligning with the state party platform. For those in the industry, there's a sense of change coming.
A lot of people look at it as the Wild West right now here in Wisconsin. It's not. It's the Wild Wisconsin. And what Wisconsin is going to do is it's going to show the rest of the country how innovative a state can really be on cannabis.
Right now, 24 states, along with the District of Columbia, legalize recreational marijuana, and 40 total legalize medical marijuana, with the most recent additions being Ohio, Minnesota, and Missouri. Chris, back to you.